All right. So let's really break down because really want to ask. All right. Really, really. Now keep in mind, if it wasn't for the study group that understood with me having a learning disability, that I was going to be way behind the curve. Honestly, whoever it was that thought of using Dungeons and Dragons to use as a study tool to teach me, like, you're the real MVP. Because the benefits that I ended up going ahead and pointing out. All right. So my goal had been to go ahead, double major, psychology, law, you know. Along the way, I had to learn enough about medicine to understand exactly what the fuck is physically wrong with me. While everyone's telling me, no, it's mental. No, it's physical. I've showed pictures and videos of my leg. That shit's damn near rotten off at this point. I mean, literally, the infection's all the way up to the inner thigh. Like, if the infection gets any worse, they're gonna have to chop it off. So I'm kind of incapacitated, IRL. But it really is an amazing fucking study tool. All right. I mean, ultimately, first off, great way to be able to actually learn details about, your case, be able to prepare for any form of deposition, whether it be arbitration, whether it be, any form of appeal, you know, ultimately, by making your arbitration a D&D campaign. Ultimately, that right there ends up going ahead and having some uses in a high conflict scenario. So, like, for example, if you have to worry about somebody who has a history of violence and tendencies, of potential, you know, like extremely high conflict, like potentially life threatening. Ultimately, going ahead and using Dungeons and Dragons for your form of arbitration, that actually goes and gives you the chance of, well, okay, here's my class type. Here's, how I'm choosing to go ahead and handle the situation. Now, keep in mind, you have to have real world rules set in place. Like, for example, in the real world, physically, you can't hit anybody, you know? Physically, you have to let somebody know. I mean, ultimately, keep in mind, the rule is you can't hit anybody, but you also have to establish you're in charge. All right? So ultimately, handling a situation through arbitration, obviously, doing it through the phone, you know, can't can't hit you physically through the phone, can't stab you through the phone, can't shoot you through the phone, you know. So ultimately, it ends up lowering the chances of, any form of domestic dispute that could end up leading to domestic violence. All right. You have the factor too that ultimately can't be like, oh, clearly leading things way, their own personal way, you know, they're intimidating the witnesses. This is Dungeons and Dragons, all right? You do realize you roll a d20 for an intimidation check, right? Like, literally, one of the mechanics is intimidation check. All right. Now, if you end up going ahead and rolling so low that you end up being, less intimidating than a gelatinous cube, not my fault. But now here's another scenario. Just keep in mind also, all right? Obviously, there's no such thing as communicating threats. That's intimidation. That right there would be, spell slot. All right. So then you also have the factor too of, ultimately going ahead and, being like, well, the mechanics of the game, open world. All right. Now here's the thing though. Along the way, you have to progressively be learning and you have to understand the circumstances and differences between rules that are getting established and rules, along the way But in order to be able to counter or negotiate the rules along the way, you have to actually learn. Like, for example, real law litigation, you know, that would actually end up being applicable. That, if you were to go ahead and go into a court of law yourself, that ultimately you'd be able to be like, oh, well, since we got to go in front of a judge and everything, this law states this law states this law states this. Ultimately, what they were doing would be considered, impeding on, civil rights and, personal freedoms, would actually be deemed unconstitutional. Ultimately, contractually, it would be considered unconscionable. Not to mention that, I have to point out, when somebody's overreaching or leading, the usual. All right. Not to mention that, but ultimately trying to go ahead and use, the way that you end up playing Dungeons and Dragons to go ahead and make a personality profile, try to use in real world, in court and real world, that's a no-no. All right. Because, literally, it's a circumstance of, hey, playing a game. All right. And literally using that game not only for anger management, but also as a learning tool. All right. Ultimately, it was also used to go ahead and work on strengthening understanding of social cues. So ultimately, it's been beneficial, not detrimental. Not to mention that, but ultimately, it can't be argued in real law, that the way you end up going ahead and playing the game is a reflection on how you are in real life. All right. So, like, for example, in game, if I go ahead and, I end up going ahead and sacrificing my wife and child, to the Fae, because ultimately they want to go ahead and, throw a plague over, the entirety of my lineage, biologically, anyone attached genetically to me ends up going ahead and, being, having a, like, say, for example, a malnourishment hex. All right. So, ultimately, that sacrifice made to the Fae, regardless of the fact where it may seem self-indulgent, because, going ahead to try to get food for myself at the same time was considered, a legitimate sacrifice, because it was a sacrifice of, someone with legitimate attachment, while at the same time, done as an act of compassion, because of the factor of not wanting them to have to deal with perpetual starvation. Kind of seeing the point, like using that as a mechanic in game, to go ahead and teach empathy, and at the same time teach the levels of cruelty that people could end up having. That's not a reflection on in real life. If anything, it's just going ahead and, teaching the way that somebody would end up reacting in life or death scenarios, which ultimately getting to know how somebody would react in life or death scenarios could end up telling anything and everything about how trustworthy somebody would end up being in real life.